Titanic, I think, is one of the most classic illustrations of that. Had just any number of things, just one thing been different, the disaster wouldn't have happened.
The story of the Titanic is one of the most famous maritime disasters in history. Immortalized by the Hollywood rendering and the numerous retellings of the story, this tale is one that many are all too familiar with. But beyond the Jack and Rose story and the tragedy that followed their forbidden romance, there are hidden sides to this story, details that might point to the circumstances that led to the unfortunate event. In this video, we will be exploring 15 mysterious photos that were taken just before the Titanic sank. Number 15. John Jacob Astor, IV. We begin our voyage on a high note with the tale of a mysterious passenger aboard the ship who was regarded as the richest man on the Titanic. For a ship with such prestige, you'd expect it to be filled with the rich and powerful, and indeed it was. Of the many affluent people on board the Titanic, however, one stands out. His name was John Jacob Astor, an American business mogul, real estate developer, and investor extraordinaire. John was a member of the famous Astor family. And here's the craziest part. John wasn't just the richest man on the Titanic, but the richest man in the entire world at the time, with a net worth of over $20 million. That's about $2.6 billion in today's money. This man was swimming in riches. Unfortunately, he was part of the 1,517 passengers who lost their lives to this unfortunate event. But what exactly was John Astor doing on the Titanic? Where was he headed? And wasn't he rescued? This is where things get interesting. At the time, John Astor's life was wrapped in controversies. He had just divorced his wife of 18 years, and society took exception to that. Getting a divorce in those days often led to a pretty huge scandal, and to make matters worse, he remarried almost immediately to a much younger woman. His second wife, Madeline Talmadge Force, was 18 years old at the time. Considering the fact that John was 47 years old, the age gap was quite significant. But the couple didn't care. They had found love, and they weren't willing to let anyone jeopardize their relationship. After their wedding, the couple embarked on an extended honeymoon in Egypt and Europe in order to give the gossip back home some time to blow over. At the time, Madeline was pregnant, and she wanted her baby to be born in the United States, so the couple booked a ticket back home on the doomed Titanic. You already know what happens next. In the wee hours of April 15, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and began to sink. At first, John assured his wife that everything was okay, and the damage wasn't really that bad. The two remained oblivious to the danger that loomed ahead, even as the first-class lifeboats were being lowered. They eventually understood the gravity of the situation and attempted to secure a place on the lifeboats, but there was a rule on the Titanic, and it was strictly adhered to. No man was allowed to exit the ship until all women and children were rescued. Madeline, her nurse, and her maid all made it off the boat, but unfortunately John Astor couldn't. Here is a photograph of Madeline's actual life jacket, a piece of history, reminding us of one of the greatest tragedies in human history. According to eyewitnesses, he was last seen standing on the starboard bridge wing, smoking a cigarette with Jacques Futrelle. About 30 minutes later, the Unsinkable cruise ship disappeared into the ocean, along with the 1,500 passengers and crew left on board. John Astor's body was later recovered on April 22, and he was buried in Trinity Church Cemetery in Manhattan, New York City. Number 14. The last photograph of the Titanic afloat. Digging into our bag of mysteries, we present to you the last known photograph of the Titanic afloat. Taken by an Irish Jesuit priest by the name of Francis Brown, this photo captures a moment frozen in time before the monumental disaster ruined what could have been one of the most impressive feats of maritime engineering. Francis Brown, the priest who took the photograph, was on a trip from Southampton to Queenstown, Ireland. He would have stayed the rest of the journey, having received an offer of a free ticket from a wealthy family who took a liking to him while on board. But as fate would have it, Brown's journey was cut short. On reaching Queenstown, he received a note from his cleric superiors instructing him to return to his station immediately. This singular alteration in his travel schedule ultimately saved his life. As the massive cruise ship sailed away towards New York on April 12, 1912, Brown took this epic photograph as if knowing this would be Way's last time the Titanic would ever be seen afloat. 3 days after this picture was taken, the megaship was at the bottom of the ocean in what is regarded as one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. Now, on to the next one. Number 13. The iceberg that sank the Titanic. On April 12, 1912, while cruising along the Atlantic Ocean, Captain W. Wood, the captain on board the SS Estonian passenger ship, took this chilling image of a massive iceberg. Why the iceberg caught the attention of the captain remains unknown. Perhaps it was due to its sheer size. 40 hours after this image was taken, the Titanic collided with the iceberg, breaking off a chunk of it and leaving a streak of red paint outline. But how do we know this was the exact iceberg that sank the Titanic, and not some other iceberg floating in the middle of the ocean? Well, we'll have to rely on the accuracy of the information inscribed on the photograph by Captain Wood. After sighting the iceberg, the captain noted the coordinates of its location, and it turned out to be almost the same as the spot where the Titanic sank. Furthermore, after completing his journey and arriving in New York, Captain Wood printed a copy of the photo and sent it to his grandfather along with a letter which read, "I am sending you a sea picture, the Etonian running before a gale and the iceberg that sank the Titanic." He also noted the coordinates of the iceberg on the letter, so it was without an iota of doubt the same iceberg that ended the voyage of the Titanic. This photograph, along with Captain Wood's letter, were recently sold at an auction for about $15,000. It was only by a stroke of luck that the captain had thought to capture the iceberg, without knowing that it was about to partake in one of the most unforgettable moments in human history. Number 12. Lifeboats of the Titanic. Now, hold on, what we are about to get into might be a little controversial. Quick question, what happens when you choose aesthetics over safety and practicality? That's right, you get a huge disaster like the Titanic. For a cruise ship as massive and revolutionary as the Titanic, so little attention was paid to the safety and protection of the passengers in the event of a disaster. Choosing an aesthetically pleasing design over the safety of the passengers and crew, the designers incorporated as few lifeboats as they could, so the ship could look more appealing to the public without being crammed with lifeboats on every side. But this isn't surprising, because the designers of the Titanic believed they wouldn't need any safety protocols or emergency procedures, at least not to a serious extent. After all, the ship was built with advanced features that made it literally unsinkable. The engineers believed they had equipped the ship to handle the worst-case scenario and still keep holding strong, so there was no need to prepare for the worst. This resulted in many acts of negligence, one of which was the fatal mistake of under-equipping the ship with an adequate number of lifeboats. Now, get this. The engineers who built the Titanic believed that the megaship was a lifeboat on its own. It was built to withstand any damage without sinking. But they surely didn't anticipate their greatest creation colliding with a floating, massive block of ice in the middle of nowhere. According to modern regulations, the number of lifeboats on a ship should be sufficient enough to accommodate 125% of the number of the passengers and crew aboard the ship. But back then, maritime regulations were still a bit relaxed. Here's the craziest part of it all. The Titanic had 20 lifeboats on board, and in total these were supposed to be sufficient enough to rescue 1,178 people, but in total, only 706 people made it out of the Titanic alive. So why was there so much disregard for lives as this dramatic event unfolded? There are many layers to this story, many of which have been clouded by the sensationalized rendering of the events that took place that day. You see, eyewitnesses report that there was an extreme case of mismanagement on the Titanic, even prior to the disaster. Both the captain and the rest of the crew ignored vital signs that could have saved the lives of so many people, for no justifiable reason. Of the 20 lifeboats the Titanic was equipped with, only 18 was used, and the strange decree issued that women and children be rescued first, which was strictly adhered to. led to the death of so many men. Many of the lifeboats were lowered half full, while there were still spaces that could accommodate a couple of men. But due to the laid-down regulations, they were left to perish. But this was not the only reason the lifeboats were left half full. The crew, fearing that the life-saving vessels might bulge under heavy weight, refused to let anyone else on as soon as they evaluated that it was a maximum optimal capacity. Although these lifeboats became a lifeline that reduced the number of casualties of the Titanic by a great number, many men died avoidable deaths on the cruise ship that could have been prevented if proper safety regulations and disaster protocols were put in place. We can only wonder how many lives could have been saved if things were done just a little bit differently. Number 11. The man behind the wheel, Captain Edward J. Smith. Hold on tight because this next one might shock you. At the helm of the affairs of the Titanic on the fateful day was Captain Edward J. Smith, a man who had amassed over 40 years of sailing experience without any accident. But here he was, about to handle one of the worst maritime disasters in history. Needless to say, he did a really terrible job. There are many mysteries surrounding this epic tale, especially as it pertains to the captain in charge, and we'll get into them one after the other. Pay attention so you don't miss anything. First was the lackadaisical attitude with which he took the news that the Titanic had struck something, which had dealt a heavy blow on the side of the ship. Fourth Officer Joseph G. Boxhall, who first reported the damage assessment, undermined the extent of the damage, as he reported that he had found no damage. But any glimpse of hope the captain had disappeared when Thomas Andrews, the head designer of the Titanic, reported that the ship had been struck so heavily that 16 of the watertight compartments that made the megaship Unsinkable had taken on water, which meant the ship was definitely going to sink. After properly accessing the damage and realizing that the ship was going down, Captain Smith ordered that the lifeboats be uncovered immediately. But here's the shocking part. This order was not carried out until 40 minutes later, because Smith had not yet given the order to begin the loading and lowering of the lifeboats, so precious time was wasted. But as the chaos reached its peak, Captain Edward J. Smith seemed to have mysteriously vanished. No one knew where he went or why he seemed to have abandoned the ship. This is where things get controversial. Although several accounts reported that the captain was nowhere to be found, other eyewitnesses said that he was seen rescuing passengers. One crazy eyewitness story even claimed to have seen the captain jumping off the ship with an infant tenderly cradled in his arms. He was said to have swam to a nearby lifeboat, handed the baby over, and swam back to the Titanic, while uttering the chilling final words, "I will follow the ship." But Smith's body was never found, leading to speculations that he may have abandoned the vessel and saved his own life. One man named Peter Pryall even reported having met him in Baltimore in July 1912. Not once, but twice. Considering the fact that Peter Pryall was no ordinary citizen, but a well-respected businessman who was not given to idle tales and hallucinations, it is believed that his story may indeed hold water. But there's more. Smith was also accused of ignoring vital warnings of the dangers that lurked within the waters ahead, transmitted to him by other ships which had traversed the rugged terrains of the Atlantic Ocean and sighted the iceberg before the Titanic met its unfortunate fate. But the captain ignored all the warning signs. So was Captain Edward J. Smith a hero or a villain? We'll leave that for you to decide. Number 10. The band that played to death. Are you ready for another bone-chilling tale from the Titanic disaster? This one might be a little different from everything you've seen so far in this video, so pay close attention. The story of the Titanic featured many unsung heroes, but the most famous of them all would be the musical band on board the cruise ship. This 8-man orchestra was known to have continued dishing out tunes, even as the Titanic headed towards its impending doom. These 8 musicians traveled as second-class passengers and were initially tasked with playing during tea time, Sunday services, after-dinner concerts, and more. But as soon as the ship hit the iceberg, the band resorted to playing soothing music in order to calm the passengers down. Led by Wallace Hartley, the band assembled in the first-class lounge to play, and they later moved to the forward half of the deck, where they kept playing until the ship sank. Their story remains one of the most captivating accounts of the disastrous event, With the final notes of "Nearer, My God, to Thee" echoing into the night, the megaship gave up to the grips of the mighty ocean, and along with it the 8-man band and several other passengers and crew. Today, these men are remembered for their heroic acts and calmness even in the midst of the troubles. Now, here's the interesting part. These musicians were not dishing out tunes because they saw a glimmer of hope. No, they knew for sure the ship was going to sink, and they were going down with it. Therefore, they decided to make their last moments as epic as possible, playing music to calm the souls of everyone stuck on the doomed vessel. Today, we remember them for their heroic acts, and we say their names, even as we thank them for their immense bravery. William Brayley, he was 24 and played the piano. Roger Bricoux, age 20 and played the cello. John Clark, 28, bassist. Jock Hume, 21, and he played the violin. George Crins, 23, violinist. Percy Taylor, he was 40 and played the cello. John Wesley Woodward, he was 32, and he also played the cello. Finally, the man in charge, Wallace Hartley, he was 33, was the bandmaster, and he played the violin. Please drop a comment to pay your respect to these heroic musicians. Number 9. Heroic Engineers. Immerse yourself in this epic tale of bravery displayed by the engineers on board the Titanic. This group of highly educated individuals were the highest-paid members of the crew, and for good reasons. They were responsible for keeping everything running. The generators, the engines, and the mechanical equipment on the Titanic were under the control of the engineers, and it was in part thanks to them that so many people were able to make it out of the disaster alive. Before the ship sank, everyone was in a jolly good mood, going about their assigned business. But when things took a dramatic turn, they all switched to emergency mode. As the ship hit the iceberg, and it was obvious that that would be the end of the behemoth, the brave engineers engaged the ship in a losing battle, as they attempted to keep it afloat for as long as possible. You could sense the tension in the air as some of these engineers attempted to operate the pumps in the forward compartment, while some tried to keep the steam up in the boiler rooms in order to prevent a boiler explosion on contact with the water. Some engineers rallied to keep the generators running so as to maintain power and lights throughout the Titanic. Get this, up until 2 minutes before the ship sank, all electronic systems kept working, thanks to the brave efforts of these engineers. It is believed that their heroic actions kept the ships afloat for an extra hour, enough time for nearly all the lifeboats to be launched. Many of the engineers made it out alive, and some were rescued by ships like the Carpathia, which arrived 2 hours after the ship had sunk. Unfortunately, 244 members of this engineering team, which consisted of 2 boilermakers, 176 firemen, 73 coal trimmers, 33 greasers, 8 electricians, and 6 mess hall stewards, lost their lives to the tragedy. The chief engineer was a man named Joseph Bell, and his headstone remains at Farnham, near Brampton, Cumbria. A memorial to the Titanic engineers was also erected in Southampton, from where many of them came. Today, we remember them, and we salute them for their bravery. Number 8. The Maiden Voyage. This image captures the historic moment when the Titanic set sail traveling from Southampton, England to New York. The day was April 10, 1912, and the voyage was dubbed the Millionaire's Special. The captain himself was known as the Millionaire Captain because of his popularity with wealthy passengers. Many prominent people were on board the Titanic, including American businessman Benjamin Guggenheim, British journalist Willem Thomas Stead, and Isidore Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, along with his wife, Ida. The voyage seemed to have been doomed for disaster as it almost started with a collision when suction from the Titanic caused the docked New York vessel to swing into its path. After an hour of painstakingly trying to avoid an accident, the Titanic was underway. Who would have known when this picture was taken that it would all end in tragedy? Number 7. Fire in the hull. Brace yourself for this portion of the Titanic story that is often overlooked by the media. Although the megaship was definitely destroyed due to its collision with an iceberg, there was another internal disaster, which might have played a huge part in the final demise of the ship. During an investigation into the events surrounding the Titanic incident, An Irish journalist by the name of Senan Maloney discovered several photographs chronicling the ship's construction and the preparations for its maiden voyage. These photographs were said to have been taken by the chief engineer of Harland and Wolff, the company that constructed the Titanic. Looking closely at one of the photos, Mr. Maloney discovered a 30-foot-long diagonal black mark on the front starboard side of the hull. Further investigations later revealed that the fire was likely caused by a fire in a coal bunker of the ship. The fire is believed to have damaged the wall of steel within the ship's hull, making it more vulnerable to damage. But there's a strange twist. According to reports, during the official British inquiry into the incident in 1912, there was a mention of the fire, but the judge, who was apparently sympathetic to the shipping interest, played down the claims. According to Mr. Maloney, the owners of the ship knew about the damage done by the fire and the dangers it posed, but chose to go on with the voyage, positioning the ship in such a way that the passengers were unaware of the damage that the ship had taken. Was the sinking of the Titanic an avoidable disaster, or was it all just fate? Unfortunately, we'll never know. Number 6. Titanic life jackets. One thing that was definitely sufficient on the Titanic was the life jacket supply. Everyone had one. These jackets were made out of canvas and cork, and although the design was great, it fell short by today's standards. But that's okay, because this was back in 1912 after all. These life jackets became the saving grace of so many people after the tragedy struck, although it also indirectly led to the death of quite a lot of people. But how? Hold on, we'll get into that. As the giant Titanic neared its ultimate end, many of the passengers gave up hopes of joining the lifeboats on a life-saving trip and instead resorted to jumping from the heights of the ship straight into the ocean in the hope that the life jackets would help keep them alive, at least until further help arrived. Unfortunately, many who jumped were knocked unconscious as soon as they hit the waters, leading to their demise. These life jackets, however, played a huge role in the rescue efforts, and because of them, so many passengers were saved from drowning before they were finally picked up by rescuers. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. Following the unfortunate events of the Titanic sinking, several conspiracy theories began to emerge. Many claimed that the iceberg story was just a cover-up for the real events that led to the sinking of the Titanic. This image, which recently went viral online, appears to show torpedo damage to the frame of the ship, lending credibility to claims that the Titanic was a victim of an aggressive attack by an unnamed military force. Although there is indelible proof that the ship was a victim of an unfortunate iceberg accident, many still hold on to these sensationalized theories. Do you think there is more to the story of the Titanic tragedy than the authorities have let on? Share your view with us in the comments. Number 5. The story of Miss Unsinkable. Let us diverge a bit as we recount the epic tales of Violet Jessop, also known as Miss Unsinkable. This nurse was part of the passengers who were able to make it out of the Titanic alive. But there's a creepy part to this story. Miss Jessop was also said to have been on the RMS Olympic when it collided with and sank the HMS Hawk on September 20, 1911. But that's not all. This lucky lady was also on board the ill-fated Britannic, which sank after it struck a mine on November 21, 1916. Amazingly, Violet Jessop survived all of these incidents and eventually died of heart failure at the ripe age of 86. Another such character was Arthur John Priest, who was a fireman on the Titanic and was part of the crew that survived the crash. He also survived on board the RMS Olympic during the disaster of 1911 and was also aboard the Britannic when it sank in 1916. But he survived them all. Priest also survived other disasters, including the losses of Alcantara and Donegal in World War I. Ultimately, Priest was forced to retire from the sea because no one was willing to sail with him. He eventually died of pneumonia at the age of 50. Could all these events have been interconnected, or was it all a coincidence? This story remains shrouded in complete mystery. Number 4. Robert Douglas Speden, Titanic's child survivor. About 109 children were said to have been aboard the Titanic when it sank. Out of them all, the story of Robert Douglas Speden remains one of the strangest to ever come out of the Titanic tragedy. Born on November 19, 1905, in Manhattan, New York, Robert was the only child of Frederick Oakley Speden and Margaretta Corning Speden. The family lived well, as Frederick was a banker, so they had a lot of money to finance expensive trips around the world. One of such trips took them aboard the Titanic, after which life never remained the same. Robert, who was 6 at the time of the incident, slept through the night, only to wake up in the middle of the chaos and innocently exclaim, "Look at the beautiful North Pole, without Santa Claus!" Fortunately, all members of the family, including the maids, were rescued on Lifeboat 3 and subsequently picked up by RMS Carpathia. Unfortunately, his existence was short-lived. Robert died about 3 years later, after he was hit by a cargo truck in Winter Harbor, near the family's summer camp in Maine. His story tells of a huge tragedy, a life lost without fully unfolding his full potential. Number 3, the Titanic Pool. Take a deep dive with us in the luxurious swimming pool, which was a huge feature of the Titanic. Surprisingly, the ship only had one swimming pool, which was heavily restricted. If you thought segregation wasn't a thing on the Titanic, think again. This pool was only available to the first-class passengers and was located on the starboard side of F deck. The Titanic swimming bath was 30 feet long, 14 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. There was a portion of time assigned so men could swim for free, but women were only allowed to swim between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m., and they paid for it. Also, no children were allowed in the pool, and men and women were not allowed to swim together. Images of the pool taken before the unfortunate incident that destroyed this massive behemoth tell of a time before disaster. It features the revolutionary design, believed to be the envy of the maritime world, before an unfortunate disaster stripped it of its glory, sending it down into a watery grave, where it still sits till today. Number 2, Titanic Gymnasium. Of all the luxuries that the Titanic was equipped with, the gymnasium was one of the most famous. This world-class facility was located on the forward grand staircase along the starboard side of the boat deck. This wonderful innovation caught the eye of many of the passengers at the time, its exotic design screaming luxury at every angle. The room was brightly lit and featured white-painted oak paneling and beautifully tiled floors. The gymnasium was more of an amusement place than a fitness facility, although it featured exercise equipment like the electric camel, cycling machines, an electric horse, a rowing machine, and of course some weights. The design of the gym was very luxurious and served as a testament of the thought and dedication that went into making the Titanic an experience of a lifetime, although it ended up taking it a bit too literally. Photographs of this gymnasium remind us of the luxurious environment created by the builders of the Titanic, which unfortunately didn't last more than one voyage. Number 1, first-class dining room. As we wrap up this adventure, we pay a visit to the first-class dining room on the Titanic. This dining saloon was one of the 5 locations where the first-class passengers were supposed to eat. Everything about this room screamed luxury. From the design to the decorations, even to the service delivered by the crew, everything was top quality. The first-class dining room was located on the D deck and measured about 114 feet in length and 92 feet in width. There were 115 tables set, which could seat about 554 people, so this was more like a banquet hall. The dining room's portholes were elegantly concealed by inner leaded glass windows, which gave the passengers the impression that they were eating on shore instead of at sea. The most exotic meals were served here, which could only be afforded by the rich. Other eating areas were made available for lower-class passengers, but this one was reserved for the first-class passengers. Unfortunately, this image remains the only surviving photo of the first-class dining saloon, reminding us of the moments before disaster struck and everyone's life was significantly altered. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.